He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora and a very warm welcome. I'm Alison Ballance and this is the Kākāpō Files from RNZ. It's season 2 and we are going to be following what we hope will be the biggest kakapo breeding season on record. It's mid-December 2025 and this is episode 1, in which I am quizzed on many things kakapo by my wonderful colleague Claire Concannon, host of the science show Our Changing World.
Today I'm talking with the radio legend that is Alison Ballance, who in 2019 followed the Kākāpō breeding season, which at the time was the longest and the biggest of all time. Over 70 chicks fledged that season. She followed it from December 2018 all the way through to September 2019. 24 episodes of the Kākāpō Files. And that was season 1, and season 2 is coming. Kia ora, Alison.
Kia ora, Claire. It's so lovely to be back talking and thinking and breathing kakapo again.
Yes, let's do it. And let's just start with a Kākāpō 101. Give me the introduction. What is a kakapo?
For a start, it's the world's largest parrot, and you might ask, how big is big? Well, anything from 1.5 to 4 kilos, that's quite an armful of bird.
Yeah, they're quite chunky looking. They're pretty roundy and flightless, right?
Yep, the only flightless parrot out there as well.
But great climbers, excellent climbers.
They can climb like there's no tomorrow. They sometimes jump out of a tree thinking mistakenly that they can fly, but they have the flying ability of a brick. But climbing, they are fabulous.
Right, and that's how they get around and also get the snacks, because these parrots are vegetarian?
Yep, berries and leaves are on the menu. Lots of different kinds of berries and leaves.
And we are making such a big deal about their breeding because these birds don't breed every year. There's a lot of different really interesting things about kakapo breeding. Can you give us a few of the highlights?
The one thing that you need to know about kakapo is you have to be very, very patient if you're going to be following kakapo, because they only breed every 2 to 4 years. And the last time they bred was 4 years ago. And I can say then that the population reached a high of 252 birds, which was amazing.
That was the 21-22 season. There was 57 chicks fledged. So that was the population high at the time. As you say, 4 years ago, numbers have dwindled a bit since. And now we're coming into this new season with about 237 birds. Is that right?
Last I heard it was 237 birds, and hopefully it's still the same.
And they are lek breeders.
Yeah, it's an unusual breeding system. The males display and compete to attract the females. In the case of kakapo, they spend all night, every night for months on end booming, this deep, resonant booming sound that carries through the forest. And then they have another sound, a higher sound called a ching. They do that and the females go, oh, I like the sound of that. And then they decide which male they're going to mate with.
Do they have to kind of build an attractive area as well? Do I have that right?
That's exactly right. They build what we call a track and bowl system. So they're effectively just tidying up a patch in the bush. They make tracks, which are like little pathways leading towards 1, 2, sometimes 3 bowls, which are just depressions scooped out of the ground. And when the male is booming, he sits in one of these depressions, and that's the focal point of his display area.
Once the mating happens, are they working as a team then? Or who does the kind of heavy lifting fall to?
The heavy lifting is definitely falling to the female. She is the archetypal solo mum. He's done his bit. She now has to find a nice nest under a tree or something on the ground. She will incubate her eggs for nearly a month, and then she'll spend the next 4 or 5 or even 6 months raising her chicks to independence.
These kakapo, today, Alison, we find them on offshore predator-free islands off the South Island. Now, there are a few that are scattered in other places. They once would have been widespread though, right?
Well, I've heard numbers saying they were the 3rd or 4th most common bird throughout New Zealand. So they were everywhere. They were in big numbers.
Yeah, but now confined to Waiponamu mostly, where they're taonga to Ngaitahu.
Yep, the iwi Ngaitahu, they are definitely a taonga species to them. And we have to remember too that they are very endangered. So on the threat classification ranking that they have here in New Zealand, they are threatened, nationally critical. So they went from being one of the most common birds to one of our most endangered.
You know, I've said you're known for the Kākāpō Files, this amazing series that was on RNZ. But your involvement with Kākāpō actually started long before that, right?
My involvement with Kākāpō goes back to 1995. And that was a real high point for me in my just life journey, really, getting involved with Kākāpō. But that point in time was a real low point for the Kākāpō population. So at that time, there were just 51 known birds. There were 21 females, 30 males. And the other significance of 1995 is that it marks the beginning of the Kākāpō recovery program that the Department of Conservation runs in its current form. So there had been some conservation work done before, but the program as it currently runs also kicked off in 1995. And you need to remember that in the 10 years running up to 1995, there had only been 3 Kākāpō chicks that survived to adulthood.
Wow.
There was Dobby and Stumpy and Hawkie. And then, as we've already mentioned, you fast forward 30 years, and now we have 237 living Kākāpō.
Yeah. I mean, that's, as you say, it's been a big journey, a lot of effort on behalf of the Kākāpō Recovery Program and Ngaitahu. But you name-checked birds there. So every Kākāpō has a name?
It does, and it's wonderful. It's following in that great tradition of the late Jane Goodall, for example, who gave all her chimps names. And every name tells a story, so it really helps you understand that individual bird and its life and its family. And I began collecting the names back in 1995, and it's now an A to Z of all known Kākāpō, actually going back to 1955. And it also serves not just as a record of the names, but it's a concise history of Kākāpō conservation. And it was also the first pedigree or family tree of Kākāpō when we sat down and started going, well, who's related to who?
It was one of the things I think that stood out for me in the Kākāpō Files first series was that we really got to know not just the human characters, but these Kākāpō characters as well. But is it really A to Z?
Yeah, it's a complete alphabet soup. I did go through and add it up the other day, and I've got 360 names. And there's also another 15 birds that we knew of in Fiordland that never got names. So basically, since 1955, we've known of 375 Kākāpō.
Wow, right. Okay, well, tell me then about Kākāpō Z. Who's Kākāpō Z? What's their story?
That's Zephyr. That is a very fine choice. She has a really interesting story. So she was found in 1981 on Rakiura, Stewart Island, when she was just a chick. And to put that in context, the Rakiura population had only been discovered just 4 years earlier.
Wow.
Before that, we only knew of a few old males in Fiordland. And Zephyr's mum is Nora, and Nora was only the second female ever found on Rakiura. And in 1981, her nest, which had 2 chicks in it, Zephyr and Adler, who got named after the dog that found them, that was the first nest seen both since the rediscovery on Rakiura 4 years earlier and actually since the beginning of the 20th century. So a hugely significant nest.
Yeah, that's wild. And it just kind of puts it into context. But Adler was named after a dog. Where did the name Zephyr come from?
Well, her mum Nora is named after the North Wind, and she's the matriarch of the Wind dynasty. So almost all her chicks have a wind-themed name. Oh. So Zephyr is a gentle breeze.
Right, okay. Which you probably don't get many of down in Rakiura, to be honest. But what happened next for Zephyr and Adler?
Well, sadly, Adler disappeared. He was probably eaten by a feral cat, and that was an increasingly common story at that time in the early 80s on Rakiura. And in fact, it got to the stage that the feral cat problem was so bad that what was then the Wildlife Service made a decision to move every kakapo they could catch to a safe island. And it was a world first. Nowhere else in the world have we moved an entire wild species to new locations. So Zephyr and Nora were caught and they were moved to Whenua Hou, Codfish Island, which is just off Stewart Island. And that had just become free of weka and possums. And birds were also being taken to Hauturu, Little Barrier Island in the Hauraki Gulf, and that had just been made free of feral cats. So just in the nick of time, there were some safe islands to take them to.
And as you say, world first, like that really radical decision to relocate these wild birds to these safer spaces, which is where breeding still happens today, right? Is Whenua Hou is one of the breeding islands still. And
that's Kākāpō Central.
Yeah. And did Zephyr go on to breed on Whenua Hou?
She certainly did. So 1992, when she was 11, was the first time she bred, and she produced 3 chicks, and it was a Rimu mast year, and we'll be learning more about that as the Kākāpō Files go along, so basically a mass fruiting of the Rimu trees, except the Rimu didn't ripen, and it was a disaster.
So what happened to her chicks then?
Well, you've got to remember that it wasn't the big organised recovery program that we have today, so it was pretty low-key. By the time the rangers on the island found Zephyr's nest, one of her chicks was already dead from starvation. They rescued the other 2. They managed to rescue one other chick from another nest. They took all 3 to Auckland Zoo. 1 chick survived, and that was Hawkie. She was the first ever hand-reared kakapo.
What was next for Zephyr? Did she go on to breed again?
She did. She's actually been quite a good wee breeder. So 1997 was her next opportunity. So, we've talked about how slow kakapo are at doing things. So the next breeding season on Whenua Hou wasn't until 1997. And by that stage, we had the intensive management in place. And Zephyr had 2 chicks. And at that stage, I was making wildlife documentaries and I was filming at her nest. She had 2 sons. One was Tiwai, and another one who went on to become really well known was Sirocco, who became the spokesbird for conservation. What happened at the time was that Sirocco developed a respiratory infection. He had to be taken in for treatment, and he ended up being completely hand-reared and became the second successfully hand-reared kakapo ever. He was hand-reared by Daryl Easton, who was and still is the technical advisor for the kakapo recovery team. And he's the person who's developed all the techniques for artificially incubating eggs and hand-rearing chicks, which has been a really important part of the recovery program.
And when you say Sirocco became the spokesbird for conservation there, he actually travelled around Aotearoa, didn't he, kind of representing kakapo?
Yes, he went on tour, and it was an opportunity for people, for members of the public to go and see a kakapo, because, of course, very few of us ever get the chance to see these birds because there's not many of them. They're nocturnal and they live on really remote islands.
Yeah. So is Sirocco's mum, Zephyr, still alive?
Zephyr is still alive and she'll be turning 45 in a couple of months. And she has 10 chicks that have fledged and she's a grandmother. Oh. And her last 2 chicks were in 2022, the last breeding season, and they were fathered by artificial insemination. So that's a process that the Kākāpō team have been using to try and get particularly the genes of males who otherwise aren't breeding very successfully into the population. So the sperm came from a male called Luke who hasn't managed to produce any natural offspring, so they collected his sperm, artificially inseminated Zephyr, and she had 2 successful chicks.
Right, amazing. So that was the story of Zephyr, of the Z all the way down the bottom of your alphabet list. What about the first bird, Alison? Give me an A.
The very first bird in the Kākāpō list of names is Acheron, and he was a male hatched on Pukenui, Anchor Island in Fiordland in 2019. And his mum is Kuia, which makes him a member of the Fiordland dynasty. So Zephyr's a member of the Wind dynasty. Acheron's a member of the Fiordland dynasty. His grandfather, Richard Henry, was the last surviving mainland Kākāpō from Fiordland. And he's the only one who's contributed any genes to the Kākāpō population. And that's a story where the team have been working really hard to try and increase the numbers of Fiordland genes. And they've actually got to the point where 10% of the Kākāpō population now has Fiordland genes. So that's a bit of a success story.
Yeah, and Zephyr's story and Acheron's heritage kind of traces that history of the Kākāpō being moved onto Whenua and then the breeding program. And as you mentioned, as we went along the way, all the different interventions that the Kākāpō recovery team have kind of developed to help these birds. And they've also gotten better at like predicting when the breeding seasons are going to happen. And word on the street, Alison, is that 2026 is going to be a very big breeding season. Do we know exactly how big?
Potentially huge. It's basically the biggest one that we know of. So Kākāpō breeding is tied to the Rimu mass fruiting, and basically it takes 4 years for Rimu trees to fruit, and it works as this amazing advance warning system both for the Kākāpō and for the people who look after the Kākāpō. And so in year 3, autumn of year 3 in this 4-year process, Doc collects a sample of Rimu branches and they count the growing tips. And if more than 10% of the branches have developing fruiting tips, then some Kākāpō will breed. So the previous biggest mast on record was 2019, when we did the first season of Kākāpō Files, and the autumn count on Whenua Hau at that time was 47%. Well, this year, the autumn count on Whenua Hau was 63%. So it's by far and away the biggest Rimu fruiting season on record.
Okay, so excitement levels are high. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Rimu mast is a very important part of this. The other really important part of this is how many female Kākāpō there are. So there was a point 30 years ago, we'd had just 21 female Kākāpō. How many females of breeding age do we have now coming into this big 2026 breeding season?
Okay, drum roll. 4 times that. We have 84 adult females.
Wow. Okay.
And they are spread across 3 breeding islands. So some are on Whenua Hau, Codfish Island, others are on Pukenui, Anchor Island in Dusky Sound and Fiordland, and the remainder are on Te Kākahu or Chalky Island, which is also in southern Fiordland.
Right. So 3 breeding islands now. In the first series of the Kākāpō Files, there was a lot of episodes that talked about the intensive management that was going underway. So there were people who were removing eggs from females to encourage double clutching, which is where the females have a second go, right? They lay more eggs, so you're kind of boosting the amount of Kākāpō you might get in that season. There were eggs that were artificially incubated. There was lots of hand rearing and fostering. There was supplementary feeding. Will we be seeing this again this season across those 3 islands?
We'll see a bit of that, especially on Whenua Hau. So they are going to do artificial insemination again because there are some birds that they really want to get more offspring from. They will have supplementary feeding on Whenua Hau to support the females. But overall, Doc's really trying to pull back. I consider it, they're trying to do themselves out of a job, really. And so in the last 30 years, it's been important to increase numbers as quickly as possible. But you can't keep up this intensity of effort for this many birds. So this season is about leaving birds, especially on Te Kākahu, on Chalky, and Pukenui, Anchor Island, to their own devices. And having said that, the Kākāpō recovery team will still be using technology to keep a remote eye on the nesting mums. So if it's absolutely necessary, they could step in. But from a storytelling point of view, it's watching from a distance, it's going to be really nerve-wracking because we don't know what will happen and some things might go wrong. And for me, as making the Kākāpō Files, it does mean I think season 2 will have a very different vibe to season 1.
Yeah, that anxiety of kind of stepping back and, as you say, still keeping an eye, but crossing fingers and hoping that the birds left to their own devices will breed successfully. Is anyone giving you numbers? Is anyone game enough to predict how many Kākāpō chicks might be produced?
Nobody likes to count the chicks before they are fledged, is the way we put it. So much could happen. So the only number I would give you would be somewhere between 0 and 100, Claire.
Right. Somewhere between 0 and 100. And we're obviously hoping that it's more on the 100 scale of things. But what are the things that could go wrong that would keep those numbers low?
Well, unfortunately, lots of things could happen. The Rimu fruit might not ripen. It often doesn't. And in that case, chicks might starve. We might get a return of aspergillosis, which was this dreadful fungal disease that there was an outbreak of in the 2019 breeding season when they lost 2 adults and 7 chicks. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, bird flu, might arrive in New Zealand. But I would also say that in the darkest moments, there is always hope. So in 2019, during the aspergillosis crisis, the team got offers of help from vets and researchers around the world, which was really helpful, and concerned people donated money to help fund medical treatment. And I always think of an example of where you think things look totally dire, but there is still hope. In 2014, a mum accidentally stood on one of her eggs and it was almost completely broken, like the eggshell looked really smashed. Well, the rangers really carefully taped that eggshell back together and put it in the artificial incubator, and they incubated that egg and it hatched. And there's now a male called Ruapuki who's still alive and with us today who hatched from that broken egg. So there is always hope.
That's an incredible story. And as you say, those offers of help and people donating money, I mean, Kākāpō have an international following now. People can adopt a Kākāpō.
They can and they do. It amazes me, but in a sense it doesn't amaze me that people have grown to love Kākāpō because they are a very lovable bird.
Mm-hmm. And you're working with Doc's Kākāpō recovery team for Kākāpō Files Series 2. I know you've already been chatting to some of the people who are there on the ground or getting ready to go down. So what's the news from these islands so far?
So for the last couple of months, the boys have been doing lots of housework, which is always good to hear. So the male Kākāpō have been tidying up their track and bowl systems. And the first male who was heard booming this year was Faulkner in late November. So Faulkner is 9 years old, coming on 10, and so this will be his first booming season. And over the weeks that have followed, lots of other males have joined in now. So if you went to Whenua Hou and went to the top of the island at night, you would hear multiple Kākāpō booming. And can I just point out that Faulkner seems to have inherited the early gene from his mum Pearl, because she's usually the earliest female to mate. And the Kākāpō team say they wouldn't be surprised if she mates at Christmas again this year, although they suspect that most of the mating action will kick off a week or two after that, so closer to the new year.
Right, but that's coming up quick, and you'll be keeping us up to date with all the action via the Kākāpō Files.
I sure will. So Doc's Kākāpō recovery team will be sharing all the latest news with us as this boomer bumper breeding season gets underway, fingers crossed. And I'll be doing all sorts of other things as well. I'll be shining a spotlight on science. I'll be sharing the life and times of some notable individual Kākāpō. There'll be no shortage of things to listen to.
All right, Alison, are you ready for the quickfire round?
Okay, hit me.
What is the most boring thing about Kākāpō?
In most respects, Kākāpō are incredibly interesting, but they do have a very dull microbiome. They are right up there with giant pandas, apparently.
I didn't expect microbiome. It wasn't on my bingo card. Okay, give me your most interesting Kākāpō fact.
That they have a very distinctive smell. So some people describe it as quite floral, a bit like freesias. Doesn't do that for me, but it's a very sweet, musty smell, a bit like the inside of my old clarinet case. And apparently booming males have the strongest smell.
Oh, okay. When it comes to saving Kākāpō, what is their most helpful trait?
They are so tolerant. So females at the nest, Doc can rebuild their nest around them and they don't budge. You can stick cameras and all sorts of technology in their nest and they just take it all in their stride.
And what about the most unhelpful or frustrating trait?
It's really hard to catch them. They are such climbing ninjas. They are very, very good at evading capture. Kia ora, Claire. That was me in conversation with RNZ's Claire Concannon. Now, I'd love to hear from you, dear listener. If you have any burning Kākāpō questions, you can email me at kakapo at rnz.co.nz. Stay up to date with us and find us on your favourite podcast app. We're there twice, just to make it easy. Find and follow us as the Kākāpō Files, and we are also on RNZ's Wild Sounds feed, which features all sorts of nature-based stories, including Voice of the Kākāpō, which is useful if you'd like a refresher on the 2019 breeding season. We are also at rnz.co.nz, and we'll be playing on the radio as well, on RNZ National. Now please, do me a favour. Share the podcast with everyone you think might enjoy it. The nature nerds in your life. Friends who are bonkers about birds, or perhaps colleagues curious about conservation. A very big thank you to the Kākāpō Recovery Program at the New Zealand Department of Conservation, who are supporting this podcast, and of course, saving Kākāpō. You can find Kākāpō Recovery on Facebook and Instagram. A big thanks also to RNZ producer Claire Concannon, executive producer Liz Garton, production coordinator Brianna Uritich-Gregg, and sound engineer Mark Chesterman. RNZ's Kākāpō Files is presented and produced by me, Alison Ballance. I'll be back in a week for a pre-Christmas second episode, full of Kākāpō goodness. Until then, mā te wā.